Our first speaker today is Patrick O'Connor, who holds a master's degree in communications. He is a fellow in the Royal Geographical Society and an associate in the Royal Photographic Society. He is author of several books, including the one that this program is based upon, Sons of Confederate Veterans Mechanized Cavalry, 20 Years on the Road. This book includes interviews with 28 officers of the Sons of Confederate Veterans Mechanized Cavalry. He was director of the exhibit, The Tradition of Blues in Wichita African Americans Tell Their Stories, which showed at the Kansas African American Museum and was a traveling exhibit for the Kansas Humanities Council. He is working currently on the Wichita Old Neighborhoods Project, 100 interviews of people who grew up in Wichita, 1940s to 1960s. This will be housed in the Special Collections Unit at Abla Library, part of Wichita State University. Following Pat's presentation, we will hear from Dr. Sharon Cranford. Dr. Sharon Cranford has been a member of the League of Wichita Voters since 2000 and has served on the board for Wichita Metro for the past 5 years. A Texas to Kansas transplant, Cranford comes from a diverse background. After a career in mental health, diversity training, and education spanning 30 years, Cranford retired and co-authored a book tracing her family's heritage entitled Kinship Concealed, Amish, Mennonite, African American Family Connections. She is president and historian of Arise Spirituals and Storytelling Ensemble. Sharon ensures that the stories undergirding the spirituals that they sing are moving and authentic. She is an original scholar and charter member of Arise Inc., which exists to bring cultures together through the universal language of music. We will begin with Pat's presentation.
Thank you for those kind words. And thank the library and the League for presenting this difficult topic in these troubling times. Also, thanks to the library for letting me use their facility. Otherwise, my screen would be blacked out. Here we go. I think we can all agree that slavery is an abomination and taking up arms against the federal government is a mistake. I'm here to reveal what descendants of Confederate soldiers and sailors think about their monuments. And this is from 28 interviews I did for my book in 2016, 2017. My findings on the monument history come from an article by John J. Winberry, published in the Southeastern Geographer. Let's try geographer. Somebody didn't write this right. The University of North Carolina Press, November 1983, entitled, Lest We Forget, the Confederate Monument and the Southern Townscape. The Southern Poverty Law Center found 780 monuments nationwide. That's an old number. I'm sure there aren't that many anymore. No, there's one in Kansas, in Wichita, at Veterans Memorial Park, which will be shown in one of the slides. It is actually a monument for both sides who fought in the Civil War. That'll show. And these slides are in no particular order. I just wanted you to see a few of the monuments that populate the South. Winberry found that a monument is a structure, usually of durable material, that has a symbolic or memorial value. The meaning of monuments can change over time as they are viewed by each generation. We're certainly finding that out. Further, there are 4 basic locations for these Confederate monuments: battlefield, cemetery, courthouse, and urban, and the grounds of state capitals. Well over a third of the courthouse monuments that Winberry studied were dedicated specifically to the Confederate dead. The erection of monuments was undertaken most frequently by Southern women. Women get things done, don't they? Organized soon after the war in a Ladies' Memorial Association, and after 1895 in the United Daughters of the Confederacy. As soon as the war ended, concern was expressed for those buried on distant battlefields and in unmarked graves. The monument was an attempt to preserve the memories of the Confederate soldiers and sailors. Also, now this is important, by the early 1900s, many individuals who had been ruined after the war had rebuilt their lives and fortunes. The memorial was as much a monument to them as to the Confederate past. That might explain why they hold on so hard to these monuments, to their memory and honor of them. A third explanation for the monument was the theme of the lost cause, which was, I'm sure you know, and he points out, Winbury points out, a cult of archaism, a nostalgic vision of the past, which is basically that the South was right. A monument is primarily a reminder of the past, a symbol of another community to which we belong, Winbury writes. Its roots are deep and tie a people to their past and its traditions. It is not a symbol shared necessarily by blacks or newcomers, but it does unite a people and their history. This again from Winbury. And then we get into my interviews. I did these interviews over the phone. I did not travel through the South. I don't like doing phone interviews, but they probably didn't like it either, having a Yankee call them up from Kansas. But we got along. Here's what Captain Frank Baptista from Virginia says. I love going on rides, saving our monuments, our history, our heritage, and flag. I will fight for that with my last breath. Captain Bill Starnes, North Carolina. In our company, I think we have around 160. That's a large company. Companies are usually one per state. I think Virginia has 2. We are the only mechanized cavalry company that owns their own cannon. We are real proud of that. We raised money for it. Most of what we do right now to raise money goes for the preservation of the Behringer headquarters flag here in North Carolina. Michael Paul Mroxa from Maryland. Bill Starnes was number 58. No, member 58 out of, I think there are about 3,300 members now. And Mroxa says, things are going well now. The bad boys know us and they leave us alone, which, for you musical buffs, is a quote from a Beach Boys song, to wit, I Get Around. I thought that was nice for him to put that in there. They appreciate what we do. And the bad boys in this case are the 1%, the outlaw bikers, which give any biker group not affiliated with them within the state a lot of hassle, unless you jump through enough hoops or unless you were there before they were. You can't just start a new club in a state because each state is controlled by 1%, 1%ers. That is outlaw bikers. Hells Angels. In our state, it's the Sons of Silence. They control Kansas. Now there's the Wichita monument. Reconciliation. Nicely done. We do a lot of battlefield runs. I have been going down to Virginia to their annual. And this is one thing they do with Sons of Union veterans. They go to Gettysburg battlefield and do monument cleanup. Captain Archie Toombs from Louisiana. At Shreveport, that is where the last Confederate flag flew for a little under a month after the Confederate surrender. We were the last ones to surrender. It's one thing to say it, but we make it part of our ride. When you go to that monument and stand in front of it and you read that bronze plaque, it means a whole lot more. You were actually standing on that spot. It's something to be proud of. And there's a cover of the book that I put together. Captain Francis Polk from Texas. We've had monuments, statues, plaques taken down in Texas. This goes way back. They tore the plaques off the Texas Supreme Court building. The Confederate veterans built that building and donated it to the State Court of Law out of their pension fund. It is still in limbo in the courts. Of course, we fight it like everyone else does. They just pulled the Jefferson Davis statue away from the University of Texas. I think some of these groups were just waiting for something to happen. He's referring to the Charleston, South Carolina shooting, church shooting in 2015. I'm not going to dignify that with any more information. It was a horrible tragedy. I can't understand it. When it triggered, it hit the SCV, that's the Sons of Confederate Veterans, so fast, it took them a while to answer back. So he marks that instance as the beginning of the current wrath against monuments. And Captain Kane out of Kentucky, this is interesting, his take. The government claimed that the Confederate soldier was a veteran. And in fact, you can get a headstone from the Veterans Department for a Confederate soldier if you can prove that one is buried there without a headstone, just like a Union veteran. And he deserved the same honors and privileges as any veteran of the United States. Monuments, markers, war memorials. So how are they able to take all this away when this is the law, he asks. This is what I'm telling my people. Anything we lose between now and then, when they finally come to their senses, is gone forever. We will never get it back. If these people who were taking all the statues and monuments and flags, if they looked at the big picture, we asked them, what if it was your great-great-grandfather that was buried under these monuments? Captain Kevin Brown, Arizona. Mainly, we just support the SCV, riding in procession to grave sites and whatever else they need us for. And now we do guard duty for monuments and sites because we don't want those defaced. And then this is from the chaplain-in-chief, Charles Cole, Kentucky. The Lord has blessed the Southern people. We lost the war. I know we were right in what we were doing, but what happened, I think the Lord had other work for us to do. We had Christianity sweeping across the country to the west. After the war, the people were so devastated, they moved on to try to find a place. A lot of them were slaves, and they took the gospel with them. And then from the founder, Colonel Reuben Hamby, founded 20 years ago when this was taken down. We are certainly under the gun now with the latest problems. Hopefully the mechanized cavalry can play a big role in protecting our monuments and the flag. And now for some analysis taken from, for the most part, the Handbook of Symbolic Interactionism by Larry T. Reynolds and Nancy J. Herman Kinney, who were the editors. A very valuable little book of about 1,000 pages, which is a strange length for a handbook. Nonetheless, I ordered it, I read it. Symbolic interactionism, SI, is, this is a quote from the book, a micro-level theoretical framework and perspective in sociology that addresses how society is created and maintained through repeated interactions among individuals. Central to SI thought is the idea that individuals use language and significant symbols in their communication with others. Like so much of academic writing, they take a lot of words to state a few obvious facts. But I like the symbols, significant symbols, and that's what we're going to talk about. Human agency, one of the 4 principles of SI, is the active, willful, goal-seeking character of human actors, individuals or collectives. It is associated with movement activists. We're seeing that these days. And this explains a lot of the anti-Confederate movement. Symbolization. It is particularly adept at describing Confederate monuments. Here's another quote. Human behavior is partly contingent on what the object of orientation, in this case, the Confederate monument, symbolizes or means, and that the meanings are not intrinsic, but are assigned through interpretive processes. This is why we are here today. These monuments do not have an intrinsic value. They have an intrinsic meaning. They have an assigned meaning. Within SI, social movement organizations are associations of persons making moralistic and idealistic claims about how human, personal, or group life should be organized. The study of SMOs is a special case of the study of the contention of deeply conflicted realities. The Sons of Union veterans of the Civil War put out a statement opposing the removal of any Confederate monuments or markers. These are Union veterans. On the grounds of it being, in quote, politically correct, unquote. That's from them. The people whose ancestors were shot at, maimed, slaughtered by the Confederates, soldiers. All right, here we go. Norman K. Denton says, we get into cultural studies now. Cultural studies shows how culture as a set of contested interpretive representational practices represents material practices, structures, flows of power, money, and knowledge. These interactional cultural processes, in turn, embody class, gender, and racial divisions and relationships involving the exercise of power. That's what it's all about, according to Norman. And then one more quote from Norman. The cultural studies researcher is not an objective, politically neutral observer, but a moral ethnographer, disclosing, illuminating, and criticizing the conditions of constraint and commodification. I don't need to say anything to that, but I will say, thus expires impartiality in research, something totally new from when I went to school. And studying communication, journalists are supposed to be not subjective. Researchers are not supposed to be moral ethnographers. But things change, and that's the fallout. Time to go?
Oh, that wasn't your timer for that.
Thank you, Pat. Our next speaker is Sharon Cranford.
Well,
Oh, were you not done?
no, but if my time is up,
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I thought you were concluding. Go ahead, finish.
Well, we had a chime here Sounded like
Here's my email.
the end. I'm just about ready to go here.
Okay.
Okay, tolerance was a theme much visited in the interviews because the mechanized cavalry members have learned this over the last few decades. They expect the same, but that's not the case. Here follows a theoretical synthesis of these interviews. Following the war, there was tolerance and unification in mind through the country. President Andrew Johnson pardoned the combatants. The South realized it lost the fight to have its own country. The Confederates were still loyal to their state and their region. The North continued to possess most of the wealth in the United States. Brown versus Board of Education began the process of integrating schools. And however, throughout the South, federal action was viewed as intervention in state affairs. No matter the patent unfairness of segregation, this branded the South as racist. The social movement known as political correctness came to the fore in the 1970s, brought about by the civil rights, youth movement, women's movement, and other attempts at power sharing through inclusiveness. That's the whole thing. That's the nutshell. Power sharing through inclusiveness. That's what they want. So, gone was the equal application of Boas's cultural relativity, which is something I was taught, defined as understanding another culture in its own terms, sympathetically enough so that the culture appears to be a coherent and meaningful design for living. Well, to sum up, PC is essentially an anti-history movement. No wonder the young have little interest in their history. The SCV mechanized cavalry have learned tolerance and they ask for the same. They are not tolerant of racism. Their Constitution states this clearly. The sons of Confederate veterans shall be strictly patriotic, historical, educational, fraternal, benevolent, non-political, non-racial, and non-sectarian. So this is what the mechanized cavalry believe, in my estimation, based on my interviews, and of course, in a larger sense, the sons of Confederate veterans. In fact, the mechanized cavalry are usually thought of as the radical movement within the Confederate veterans. Books are available at Amazon and eBay, but they are not sold locally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. And now it's time for Sharon Cranford. Sorry I interrupted before.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank my sisters of the League of Women Voters, Wichita Metro, certainly the Wichita Public Library, and also Pat O'Connor. That was an excellent expose of historical documents and monuments. Appreciate that, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak on this very important topic. I do not have pictures. You'll just have to either look at me or just click me off when you get tired of looking at me. But you will find that as we go through this, my point is to share that the Confederacy and all of their monuments and vestiges or relics they are reminders of America's very painful history, and they should be relegated to museums dedicated to teaching and sharing information about what America got wrong. Before I go any further, I will also review some of the history. As you know, the American Civil War raged from 1861 to 1865, when Southern states, 11 of them ultimately declared that they were no longer a part of the United States. That's what secession means. They developed their own constitution. They elected their own president in Jefferson Davis. And so according to their own constitution, Article 1, Section 7, they intended to maintain the institution of slavery. And so despite the glorified information that some historians began to teach almost immediately following the ending of the Civil War, but definitely in the 1890s, we know that these monuments do not represent states' honors, states' rights and family honor. The war was waged to maintain slavery primarily, and it was designed to overthrow a centralized government that at least claimed that it wanted to move toward its creed of freedom. So we know that deciding to overthrow your government is more than a mistake. It is treason. Before the Compromise of 1850, delineating which states could have slaves and which ones could not, white Southerners knew that their days of this brutal practice was on borrowed time. That is why they agreed to the compromise. Otherwise, we might have gotten into the war in around 1850 instead of 15 years later, when Abe Lincoln's name had been bantered around a few years earlier. And these states, these Confederate people who we want to honor and have in our parks for our children to look up to, they began to plot their treasonous coup at that time. Several states declared, including my home state of Texas, that they would never free enslaved people in their territory. And I would encourage you to read the research by Dana Berry of November 2014, who reported in the Express News. In fact, based on Lincoln's abolitionist record, the Confederates said if Lincoln won, they would secede. And that is exactly what they did. Allow me to digress for just a few minutes and share a personal story. My great-great-grandmother, Elvira Bowles, was interviewed in 1936 as a part of the government Federal Works Project. She was 94 years old at the time and had been out of bondage since 1865, 71 years earlier, and she was 23 years old. I have a copy of her testimony, and I'll figure out how to get a copy to anyone who is interested in hearing her stories, because she also references other prior enslaved people who spoke during this period of time about what Confederacy really was and what they really did. You may be aware that between 1936 and 1938, the United States government interviewed hundreds of emancipated African Americans to understand what they endured and who put them through what. I mention that because it is so easy for some people to go along with what they read in modern day books. It is quite another to learn the truth from people who endured it and lived to tell it. My great-great-grandmother related that her slaveholders lied to them as they were on a forced run under the cover of night from Mississippi to Texas in 1865. The slaveholders claimed that they were saving them from Northern soldiers. They later learned that they were trying to avoid freeing them by running to Texas, which had sent messages to other states that Texas would withstand the federal government and establish its own nation, maintaining slavery. But so even though Louisiana was the last state to actually surrender, it was because Texas, which was right next door, emboldened them. And Texas, you know, you see these commercials nowadays, a whole nother country. They really believe that, and they always have. But Texas had to fold too, thank God. Federal troops rode through Galveston on Juneteenth, 1865. I will talk more about Juneteenth next month at our monthly meeting. I encourage you to tune in if you can. But these troops went through following the surrender in April of 65, but it was a long ride. They finally got to Galveston, Texas, fighting and freeing people all the way through. I encourage you to read some Texas history during that era, because various surrenders continued in Texas and other states and on into 1866 as enslaved people were set free, and not before those surrenders took place. So it's a big difference between 63 and 65. The fighting was going on and the fighting continued. And Texas was such an intricate part of maintaining enslavement in this country. And some of these monuments that are being taken down, people are understanding and reading about the true Confederacy. And I would also say to all African Americans or mixed race individuals and families who are tuned in today with Texas roots, I have a request. If you would ask your older relatives when your families came to Texas, if you know some African Americans, ask them this. I can tell you that on both sides of my families, all of them were transplanted in the 1860s. Coincidentally, as the federal government began to close in on the Confederacy, from Mississippi to North Carolina to South Carolina, they all were forced into Texas so that the slaveholders could keep slavery alive. They thought forever. You may have noticed that the correlation between slavery, treason, and these Confederate soldiers kind of work together. And it is so very personal to me. Very personal to me. I would tell you that, excuse me, I didn't really have to do a whole lot of research, but I did some because documentation means a lot. Even though it's ironic to me that for hundreds of years, you make it illegal for certain people to learn to read and write. And then you say, well, where is that written? It must not have happened. I assure you, oral history is very important. And I'm so proud and happy that the federal government had public works and were able to document this information before our people passed away. So our people lived through the ugly truth, and they did live long enough to tell it. And let me say this also, Abraham Lincoln did not free enslaved people. Abraham Lincoln did not free enslaved people. Bless his heart. Toward the end, there is evidence to show that he wanted to. At first, his goal was just to preserve the nation, to preserve the whole nation in spite of what the Confederacy was up to. But he evolved by 1863 and really put in the work. Even though the proclamation did not carry any weight in the South, it was a great bluff. You may have heard the story that Lincoln freed Black people, in 1863, but they didn't know it until 1865. That too is untrue. The war was still going on in 1863, so the Confederate president and Southern generals and Southern slaveholders ignored it. Why wouldn't they? It's two different countries at this point. They have their own president, their own constitution. So it would be like in modern day, the United States telling Russia what to do. How's that working for us? The war was raging and the proclamation was ignored. And after, and not until after, the Confederacy were soundly beaten, that the soldiers began to surrender state after state, and plantation owners had no choice but to let our people go. Meanwhile, the Southerners had already killed Lincoln. By the time African Americans were freed, Lincoln was dead. He was murdered in April of 1865. And it didn't take long for these Southern heritage types to renege on their terms of their parole and pardons. They were supposed to disband. They were supposed to accept the federal government's regulations, which included ending enslavement. They were supposed to pledge allegiance to the federal government and respect the American flag. They began to ignore these edicts almost immediately by instituting sharecropping, night riders who were primarily members of the Confederate Army, and continuing to fly their own Confederate flag. About 20 years after emancipation in the 1890s, white organizations, and yes, women's organizations, began to rise up and rewrite Southern history. Instead of the United States getting their arms around these revisionists, the government caved, allowing Southerners, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, led the way in erecting statues, at that time even of the Ku Klux Klan and Confederate soldiers. This group and others have planted seeds of divisiveness that may never be weeded out, but we must try. 150 years later, we're still trying to recuperate from the Civil War. There is nothing more painful than being brutalized and then being told, no, you weren't. That's your imagination. And then adding insult to injury by erecting statues to honor the people who fought to keep your family members beaten, chained, and subjugated. But fight we must. As many of us recognize the correlation between Germany's recuperation from years of Nazi rule with the years of enslavement in America. Obviously, enslavement in America lasted much longer. However, both were brutal beyond compare. Both denied people their human rights and dignity, and millions were murdered for no reason other than because of their race. At the end of those periods, however, here are some basic differences and the reason why their recuperation process is a lot further along than ours. Germany brought to court, imprisoned, and executed the traitors involved in Nazi Germany. America let our traitors go. Indeed, accepted some into the Union Army, and they turned a blind eye to the KKK. Germany tracked down the traitors and when executed, buried them in mass graves. Now, while I'm not advocating that, that's just what they did because they felt like they needed to put that whole ugly history behind them. America, on the other hand, built mausoleums and statues in their honor, in the Confederates' honor, and then named military installments after them. Germany banned the swastika on public land and other racist vestiges of that regime. It is banned. America, on the other hand, hangs Confederate flags atop state halls and other buildings and calls people who carry them around good people, flaunting its shameful slavery and Jim Crow past. I don't know how long I've been talking, but I am coming to an end here. The statues are part of our ugly history, and they must go. Let me remind you also that America's lenient amnesty agreement after the Civil War helped to proliferate the Ku Klux Klan. Its lenient public law of 1958, and I would encourage you to go to Public Law 85-825. It forgave the Confederacy crimes and deemed that their soldiers were U.S. veterans. This is what Pat was referencing when he said, it is now law that they are U.S. veterans. So they feel like because that mistake was made, we should continue to very wrongly honor these people who are, by definition, traitors to the United States. They forgave those crimes and passed off their hateful symbols as promoting states' rights and Southern heritage. It is not a heritage of which decent people can be proud. They symbolize America's dark history of hate and terrorism. The primary right that the Confederate government, they were their own government at this point, fought for was the right to own human beings and continue human trafficking. Because the Confederate nation did not want to cease and desist their free forced labor, they decided to no longer be a part of the United States. They formed their own constitution, as I said earlier, and elected their own president for this new nation. So their soldiers were never United States soldiers. They were Confederate soldiers fighting on the wrong side of the law and the wrong side of history. They were traitors who should have gone the way of Hitler and his ilk. We still have racial unrest and conflict. Some of those conflicts have resulted in violence which none of us want. But we have that going on today in part because as a nation, we have not put these statues, these flags, and other heinous representations of evil where they belong. In museums, displaying our mistakes that can never, ever be repeated. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, I think I got it. Thank you, Sharon. Now we'll take questions from the audience. I will be reading questions that have come in on the chat window. If you haven't asked your question yet, please take the time to type it into the chat window. The first question was, who owns these monuments, whether it's the public versus private? And that either one can answer this, either speaker.
They're usually partnerships. Very often, private organizations certainly started with the women's organization in the 1890s. And at that point, they were paying for it. But on state land,
private partnerships? The private part we're paying for it or the public?
Private. I'm sure
They
Pat
could
has
use
some
public
information as
They
well.
could use public lands,
I'm sorry, I can't understand.
but they could use public property to put the privately funded monuments.
Yes, it's in several states.
Okay, the next question is, how can the monuments be part of educating where they are now, where they are located now versus being torn down or moved?
I will go first again and just tell you that it is downright embarrassing. It is embarrassing and it is hurtful. They need to be in a museum so that you can be educated. Those of you who need to be educated and who feel like you need to honor people who were involved in human trafficking, if you need that, then you need to go to a special place, a specific place where that is offered.
Well, my personal opinion is that the voters will decide what happens. Majority rules.
Okay, to both speakers, and this kind of actually feeds into this question, what we've just talked about. When visual memory is erased, humans more easily fall into the delusion of denial. Example, those who deny the Holocaust ever happened. What ways to replaque or relocate a statue of a Confederate hero can change the narrative into a reminder that we are always responsible to make a rigorously honest evaluation of our beliefs and their behavioral consequences, regardless of prior ignorance or loyalty?
Well, if I understand the question, I think, you know, even though I say relegate to museums, museums are not something on the back burner. Museums and historical buildings are are very important to our history. And we do need those places. And we do need the monuments and vestiges that went with that history. And so as we tell the truth, people better understand where we were, why we did what we did. And until we really get to that, we will never be free. We can say, okay, we're gonna vote for this to be this way or that way. Until people understand, people are not going to just accept that. People, as you can see, the violence that's going on, people are not going to just lay down for, and it's, I think, ignorance. So the education is so important.
Well, when I talked to most of the men, they were against doing anything different to the monuments. But I would think that a separate monument, a separate plaque, a disclaimer could be put up that would take care of your question. Telling the public, this is a wrong time, the South lost, slavery is an abomination, like I began my speech with, and that taking up arms against the federal government is a mistake. And so that would take care of everything, in my opinion. Just put a separate monument, because if there are 780 monuments, some of them tens of feet tall, 60 feet tall, or 20 or 30, how, you know, it's not going to be easy to move them to a museum or a museum grounds. The cost is very prohibitive to move a monument. $1 million. I mean, it's incredible. So I think a more you know, we're talking about compromise, or at least I am. I say put up a disclaimer with every monument, and then that'll take care of it.
There is a comment from one of our attendees that there is a great article in the National Geographic about a monument that was moved from public land to a private cemetery, and it was a careful and measured decision. So that article may also give some insight into ideas on how to handle the monuments. I don't see any more questions. I don't see any more questions, but I do have one. Mr. Kano, you came to the league to present this topic before the current national events. When was this book published, and when were the pictures taken for the presentation? Because I had an idea that they were taken before the current national events.
Oh yes, these photos were gleaned from the internet just as a way to show people, you know, what are we talking about? What do these statues look like? Some of them are very well constructed, very well designed. But I would say, if I were an African American, I'd want them all torn down. You know, that would be my viewpoint. But I'm not. So I think a compromise would be the best solution based on cultural relativity. You can't, and as far as comparing the Confederacy to Nazis, Germany was conquered by another country. And we tried to bring the country back, bring the South back into America, try to heal, like I hope our next president will do, to heal the wounds, rather than making things, in my opinion, worse by punishing. You know, you're just gonna make these people down south mad. You're just gonna make these crackers mad if you dishonor their ancestors who were wrong in what they did. Everyone agrees. But there's got to be a compromise. That's the only way I look at it.
That was interesting, because my understanding is it depends on the state you live in how the Civil War was even taught. So there would need to be some kind of committee or something that would study how to make that presentation in a compromising, even so that things were, the education was consistent across the states. There would need to be something to mediate that. And somebody was ready, I think, to wrap this up.
I'd like to thank Pat O'Connor and Sharon Cranford for today's presentation, and the League of Women Voters Wichita Metro for their help with this program.